just last week I had a phone call from an individual, and he called one of our clients actually, and in our retail department, and he was talking about it was a fee discussion actually about how many times a year our firm look after certain files, and I sort of went through. It took me a while to recall who it was. I hadn't seen him for a long time, and I remember him when I built up the retail side, 30 years ago. And the discussion came out, so it was quite relevant, that we're in an environment now that, if someone thinks they're going to go into an industry fund or a balance fund and just set and forget, ride the index, look, with $50,000 in accumulation, that might work for a long time, but someone who's actually got more serious money, and particularly people that have got, 500 million, and right up to, clients of ours have got, 300, 400 million. That I would say now, we're constantly tweaking. Most we find now in these markets, we're tweaking portfolios between 18 to 22% on their weightings per year. So for example, the same portfolio 10 years ago was allocated to maybe 4% cash, fixed interest treasuries, 60% global equities. Well, today you can earn the same kind of rates of return, 10 and 12%. That's usually where the rates are flying from year to year, with 30% less share market exposure. Because cash rates and TDs and Treasury and corporate bonds have actually come up, from 1 and 2% up to, 5, 6 and 7% on higher rated paper. So I would say to anyone that, and particularly now, it's a stock pickers market where 10 years we've ridden the index, just buy the index, and Warren Buffett's been a big advocate of that, buying the index and holding. That now has shifted. Is that, I'm not saying that you don't buy the index, but buying the index, I'll put it to some people, you may buy the index and end up in the same place in a year. If you buy 60% of the index and 40% of certain stocks, you may achieve a 15% rate of return. So, diversification is what everyone's trained and indoctrinated to do with money. I tend to have the adverse view that I call it diversification. Now, I came up with that word 30 years ago and it didn't exist. I see it now, it's in the Oxford Dictionary, diversification. It actually exists, that word. So I find most of the wealthiest people that I've met on planet Earth, Charlie Munger being one of them, had 5 different investments outside of it, and Berkshire shares was one of them. I personally, in my world, had real estate as a big part of my portfolio and had a dozen different investments, but it certainly wasn't spread like some balance. Some balance funds today have got 780 securities. So you really do need to know where your money is exposed. It's a bit like we spoke about when we did the book launch last year. If you asked people with $1 million in an industry fund, how much exposure have they got to the 4 banks? They couldn't tell you. And you could bring 100 people up on a survey and just query them and say, listen, I'll give you $1,000 if you can tell me what percentage you have to the 4 banks in your superannuation with Australian Super. They wouldn't be able to tell you. And so you need to have, and the advice now in the industry, I mean, it's cleaned up a hell of a lot. I mean, the talent that's left is good. There's no more, I think the standards have certainly come up. When I first got in the industry as a lawyer coming into the financial service, I thought, my God, how are these people even allowed to give advice? That's changed a lot now. Most of the people that are in the industry, that's why fees have gone up. I advocate that someone should employ someone that should have an advisor if they can afford to get one, even if you're getting one that's you see once or twice every 1 or 2 years, but to get an understanding of what actually is going on in the market. I think it's critical. Well, I'm pretty hard on that. I was speaking to I had a wedding on the weekend. I spoke to a woman there, a very wealthy woman. She approached me, never met her before, and it was amazing that she had just sold a big fishing business abalone, and she's about 80 years of age, fairly substantial. And she said, I went to speak to, I've heard you're not too bad. And I said, that's nice. And she said, yes, I've been to 5 or 6 firms in Sydney and Melbourne, and she's from Tasmania. And she said, I found them all rubbish. I could see right through them and I thought they were crap. And I said, okay, tell me more. And what I was interested about is actually how she determined how good they were. And not one of them, she said, look, I don't follow the stock market, Paul, but my net worth was worth as much as the firm. And some of the firms that she was talking to are prominent firms. I'm talking substantial firms. And she said, I spoke to these people that had had 5 or 10 years of industry experience and had no business experience. So I try to, when I first got in the industry, and the answer to this is that, for me, is that I had to be, the only way to give advice like that is you've got to have the business experience and have the right and the entitlement that you've got the capital to speak from experience on how you got it and how you kept it. You know, I think it's very hard for someone to go and, you know, get advice on $5 million if you're speaking to an advisor that saved up $100,000. I can't relate to that. I don't think they've earned the right. So to be in the industry, I've always said to my advisors that you need to be in a position where you actually have the experience, have the money, and you can talk openly about why and why not just from the research companies that tell you what happened last year. And so it's difficult. It's a great question because most individuals won't know the questions to ask. They won't know how clever or what is the IQ of the person I'm handing it to. So it's a great question, and it's and it was fascinating me when I got in the industry, and I knew for a fact that I had to go up to a certain level of calibre. And when I first started, I was dealing with clients that are 100, 200,000. Now I'm dealing with clients that have got $1 billion. And so I knew that I had to be at that league, and they respected me, and they knew, well, he does know what he's talking about. He's not just a technician, he's actually at that level. So it's a great question. Unfortunately, the questions or the questioner doesn't have the right questions to put to those people, and it does take time. But it is a problem in the industry. It's a problem in the industry worldwide. I mean, that's the same for accountancy and arguably law. And then at the end of the day is that even after you've done the research, there's going to be a bit of hope and luck. I hate using those terms because hope's for the hopeless, but there's a bit of that too. But I would say that, you know, that there's 5% of the industry left that I would trust with my mother's money. So I'd say 95% aren't where they should be. And that's after a big culling of the industry by 60%. Yeah.